Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. Tonight I want to film a series of videos about several unsuccessful nominees by US presidents, former US presidents, to top-level federal offices. Most of them are unsuccessful US Supreme Court nominees. And then I'm going to also film about one controversial nominee to the US Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court's Associate Justice Clarence Thomas. Possibly another one about, I just can't remember his name. He was one of the most conservative members of the United States Senate, or one of the most conservative governors in the United States before then serving in the administration of former President George W. Bush. But this series will start with Abraham Fortas, usually known as Abe Fortas. He was born in June 1910 and died in April 1982, aged 71. He was most notably an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court from 1965 to 1969. He was born in Memphis, Tennessee, was educated to become a lawyer, and then became a law professor at Yale University, then an advisor for the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. He worked in the Department of the Interior under President Franklin Roosevelt, and during that time President Harry Truman appointed him to delegations that helped to establish the United Nations in 1945. In 1948 he represented Lyndon Johnson, who was then a U.S. representative or congressman, in the hotly contested and very controversial Democratic senatorial second primary electoral dispute, where possibly at least one or even more ballot boxes were stolen, and controversially some 200 names of voters who were claimed to have voted for Lyndon Johnson were listed in alphabetical order, or had voted in an alphabetical order, a most unlikely occurrence if it had been fully free and fair. Apparently, Lyndon Johnson reasoned that the other candidate was engaged in dirty tricks as well, so this somehow justified his own dirty tricks. And in a very narrow decision that depended on a single vote, the Texas State Democratic Committee approved the results, according to which Lyndon Johnson won the primary by just 87 votes, earning him the ironic nickname Landslide Lyndon. Had he been defeated, it would have been very difficult for him to win the general election, because in the 1940s, Texas was still a heavily Democratic state. And winning the Democratic primary for statewide offices, most notably a U.S. senator or state governor, usually meant winning also the general election, or elections to those offices. During that time, Judge Fortas and Congressman Johnson became close friends, Johnson having nominally won that truly unfair and unfree Democratic U.S. Senate primary, went on to win the general election, and then took his seat in the U.S. Senate in January 1949. Fortas also represented Clarence Earl Gideon before the U.S. Supreme Court in a landmark case involving the right to counsel or legal advisor. Following his true landslide victory in the November 1964 U.S. presidential elections, Johnson then nominated Fortas to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1965, and he was apparently easily approved or confirmed. Then the Senate included 68 Democrats and only 32 Republicans, although we should remember that several of the senators were conservative Southern Democrats. During his 3 years and 9 months on the US Supreme Court from August 1965 to May 1969, he developed a close working relationship, or maintained a close working relationship with President Johnson. However, not during his last nearly 4 months on the court, because President Johnson retired in January 1969, and he was probably distant from, or Justice Fortas was probably distant from the new president, Lyndon Johnson. In June 1968, the aged and controversial Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court, Earl Warren, announced that he would retire from the US Supreme Court, and his retirement would become effective when President Johnson would approve it. Given the fact that it was an election year and Johnson had already announced at the end of March 1968 that he would not seek a second full term as US President, something that the US Constitution would have entitled him to, because he had served under 2 years, just 1 year and 2 months of President Kennedy's, the assassinated President Kennedy's unfinished single term. And the fact that the Republicans had a strong chance to capture the presidency, given the Democrats' divisions, deep internal divisions. It was then difficult for Johnson to nominate someone who would be sufficiently acceptable to both parties in the US Senate. The Democrats had suffered losses, especially in the House of Representatives, over 40 seats, and even in the Senate 4 seats in the November 1966 congressional midterm elections. Nevertheless, he decided to nominate Fortas to replace Warren as Chief Justice. However, the Warren Court, which had made various controversial decisions, such as apparently finding pornography legal at schools, but Bible reading, public Bible reading, and public Christian or other religious prayers illegal, had angered many Americans inside and outside the judicial and political circles. Also, the apparent coddling of criminals and the liberal social policies of the Johnson administration that had, in the name of fighting poverty, apparently encouraged quite many people to keep living off welfare and then odd jobs instead of trying to become fully self-supportive. And then those racial riots that had erupted despite the liberal policies, civil rights policies that were designed to remove not only racial segregation but also racial discrimination. So given all these factors and the apparently much greater party unity of Republicans, whose nominees seem to be, yes, I will come soon, Richard Nixon, then the Senate started to filibuster Fortas's nomination. And Senate Judiciary Committee chairperson or chairman James Eastland told the outgoing President Johnson he had never seen so much feeling against a man as against Fortas. He was the first nominee for Chief Justice ever to appear before the Senate and faced hostile questioning about his relationship with President Johnson, who had consulted with Fortas about political matters frequently while Fortas was on the Supreme Court. In other words, they questioned his judicial impartiality and independence. He had accepted $15,000 of that time, much more in today's inflated dollars, for 9 speaking engagements at American University's Washington College of Law, and that became controversial because the money had come from private sources that represented business interests connected to 40 companies. Conservative Republican Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina raised the idea that cases involving these companies might come to the U.S. Supreme Court, and Fortas, should he serve as its Chief Justice, might not be objective in ruling on these payments or these companies' cases. And $15,000 of that time represented over 40% of a Supreme Court justice's salary at the time, and over half of the US president's salary at the time, because the US president's salary back in the late 1960s was under $25,000. This comes from a short book of evangelistic sermons, By the Foolishness of Preaching, written by the possibly already late Canadian Baptist evangelist Barry Moore. It was 7 times what any other American university seminar leader had ever been paid. And while the fee was legal, its size raised much concern about the Supreme Court's insulation from private interests, especially because it was funded by Justice Fortas's former clients and partners, once again guilty by association, guilty in appearance, or appearances and impressions, not necessarily even by or under the law. Senator Thurmond kept Associate Justice Fortas on the hot seat by accusing him of apparently immoral rulings dealing with pornographic films, and Fortas had consistently voted in favor of them on First Amendment grounds. He obtained some of the films in question and played them in the Senate building while the hearings were out of session, eventually admitting them to the official record. And after learning of this problem, President Johnson decided to help Fortas win a majority vote, only as a face-saving measure. On October the 1st, 1968, just 5 weeks before the US presidential election, which Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate, was expected to win over the Democratic candidate, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and the breakaway American Independent Party's candidate, then racist and segregationist Alabama Democrat and that state's former governor, George Wallace. So on October the 1st, 1968, a 45 to 43 majority of senators voted to end the filibuster, short of the 67 votes needed for cloture. In other words, to end the debate. Now, the cloture requires only 60 votes, but given the probably increasingly poisoned political atmosphere in Washington, D.C., including the U.S. Congress, it's quite difficult to obtain that majority. It was just barely the majority that President Johnson wanted to give Fortas. And later, on October the 1st, Fortas asked President Johnson to withdraw his nomination. So a coalition of Republicans and conservative Southern Democrats, or Dixiecrats, had essentially stalled Justice Fortas's nomination. In 1969, a new scandal arose. Yes, I will come soon. Fortas had accepted a $20,000 retainer from the family foundation of Wall Street financier Louis Wolfson, a friend and former client, in January 1966. In the 2017 dollars, this represented over $133,000. Therefore, he resigned from the U.S. Supreme Court in May 1969. He founded another firm, Fortas and Coven, and maintained a successful law practice until his death in 1982. He died from a ruptured aorta. His memorial service was held at the Kennedy Center with Isaac Stern and Lady Bird Johnson, the late president's widow, in attendance.